All her children abandoned her, and for many years she lived in a crumbling house without heating, surrounded by cold and trash, forgotten by everyone. She slept in her coat, survived on whatever she could find, and every day thought she might not live through the next night. But one day, she decided to sort through the old boxes under her bed and discovered something her late husband had hidden for years. Subscribe so you don't miss the continuation, and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The settlement had once been a place that appeared on road signs, a name printed in block letters at the fork where the highway narrowed and turned toward the mountains. Now, the sign was rusted and half fallen into a ditch, its letters barely visible beneath peeling paint, as if the land itself were trying to erase the memory that people had ever built lives here. The bus came only twice a week, when it came at all, and in winter the road was so deeply buried in snowdrifts that the driver sometimes turned back rather than risk being trapped between white walls that looked solid until the wind changed and closed them again. The railroad branch that had once fed the town had been dismantled years earlier. The rails sold for scrap, leaving behind a raised scar of gravel where weeds grew stubbornly in the short summers. With the factory gone and the forest thinning from overcutting, the younger families had left first, then the shop closed, then the school. What remained were scattered houses inhabited by people who had run out of reasons to go anywhere else. In one of the farthest yards from the center of the settlement stood a house that most people no longer noticed. Its roof sagged under the weight of seasons it had not been repaired for, iron sheets torn loose by storms hanging like broken wings. The veranda leaned at an angle that suggested it would collapse if someone leaned too heavily against the railing. The windows had once been white-framed, but the paint had peeled so thoroughly that the wood beneath showed gray and swollen from moisture. Snow packed itself against the walls every winter, sealing the cracks until spring thaw revealed how much had entered the bones of the structure. Inside, the house had contracted into a single room. Doors to the other spaces were closed or blocked by piles of forgotten things, not because anyone had chosen to live this way, but because one person alone could not keep an entire building warm when the furnace had long stopped working. The air smelled of damp paper, old cloth, and something faintly sweet that came from forgotten food containers. Mice had left their traces in corners where no one had bent down for months. The floorboards creaked even when no one moved, responding to temperature changes like a body reacting to pain. The woman who lived there had once been known to everyone in the settlement. She had raised children who ran through these rooms shouting and fighting, had cooked meals large enough to fill the table and then some, had hung laundry in the yard that fluttered in bright colors against the sky. Now she was 80 years old and moved through the house with care, each step calculated, because a fall could mean hours on the floor with no one to hear. She slept in her coat, wrapped in layers of blankets that no longer held warmth the way they used to, her breath visible in the cold mornings as she pushed herself upright and waited for feeling to return to her fingers. Food was measured not by hunger, but by necessity. She counted the remaining tins of beans and soup, the half bag of rice she had been saving for weeks, the hard bread she softened in tea. Water came from melting snow in a dented pot because the pipes froze every winter, and she had long stopped trying to fix them. She learned to live with thirst, with hunger, with a body that ached more in the cold than it ever had in youth. The worst fear was not the pain, but the silence. Electricity could disappear without warning when the wind tore down the aging lines, and then the house would be dark except for a kerosene lamp that left soot marks on the ceiling. She listened constantly for the hum of power, as if it were a heartbeat that told her the world had not forgotten her entirely. The contrast with what the house had once been was cruel. She remembered the evenings when her husband came home smelling of wood smoke and engine oil, his boots leaving muddy prints that she scolded him for while secretly grateful that he was there to make them. He had known every beam in the house, every loose board, every place where winter crept in, and he had fixed what needed fixing without ever talking about it. When he was alive, the cold never seemed to touch them. The children had grown up with the certainty that their home was solid, that walls meant protection, that someone would always be there to make things right. After his death, the house had changed quickly, as if it had been waiting for the moment when no one was strong enough to defend it. The children came at first, bringing boxes and promises, but their eyes did not rest on her face. They looked instead at the television, the tools in the shed, the old armchair that had belonged to their father. They spoke of selling things to make life easier, and she nodded because she was too tired to argue and because these were her children. She trusted them in the same way she always had, even when they took more than they said they would. Now she lived among the remains of all that, among piles of things she no longer had the strength to sort, each object a small monument to a life that had been large once and had slowly collapsed inward. The neighbors knew she was there, or at least they knew the house was not empty, because sometimes they saw a light through the dirty window. Few of them came close. They were afraid, perhaps, of seeing themselves in her future, afraid of acknowledging that this was where years of hard work could lead if the wrong people made the wrong choices. On this particular winter morning, she lay still for a long time after waking, listening to the wind claw at the walls. The cold was sharper than usual, a pain that settled into her bones and refused to be ignored. She felt the weight of the house above her, the slow, inevitable pull of gravity on beams that had not been repaired in too long, and she wondered, not for the first time, whether this would be the season when it finally gave up. The thought did not frighten her as much as it once had. What frightened her was the idea of being forgotten completely, of disappearing in a place no one cared to look anymore. Yet, even in that silence there remained a thin thread of memory that she could not bring herself to cut. Under the bed were boxes she had never opened after her husband's death. They were heavy with paper and years, and she had left them there because touching them felt like touching him, and she was not sure she could survive that. As she lay there, wrapped in her coat and blankets, she stared at the ceiling and tried to convince herself that she would get up, make tea, endure another day. The house creaked in response, as if urging her on or warning her not to wait too long. She did not yet know that this would be the day when the stillness of her life began to crack. The day when the forgotten boxes beneath her bed would become more than just relics. For now, all she knew was the cold, the quiet, and the weight of the past pressing down on a woman who had almost stopped believing she had a future at all. By the time the gray light of morning had fully settled into the room, the cold no longer felt like a single sensation, but like a layered presence, pressing in from every side. The house had its own language now, a vocabulary of creaks, sighs, and occasional sharp cracks when the wind struck the weakened roof. The woman lay for a long while listening to it all, and as she listened her thoughts drifted, as they always did in the quiet hours, back toward the first moment the house began to change. She could mark it with more precision than any calendar date. It had not started with the broken window or the sagging veranda. It had started with the absence of her husband's footsteps. He had been ill for longer than she admitted to anyone. At first, it had been small things, the way he paused on the stairs, the way his breath sounded too loud in the night, the way he pretended his trembling hands were only cold. The men of the settlement had always worn a certain stubbornness like a second coat, and he had been no different. He would not speak of weakness. He would not announce fear. He kept going to the shed, kept splitting wood, kept doing the small repairs that made their house sturdy against winter. When pain forced him to sit, he sat with a fixed gaze as if waiting for the moment he could rise again and return to work. She learned to read the truth in his silences. She learned to measure his exhaustion by the way he blinked. As the illness progressed, the house grew smaller around them. The rooms that had once held noise became quiet. The kitchen table, once surrounded by children, became a place where she lined up medicine bottles and cups of water. The evenings changed. She began to fall asleep upright in a chair because he might need something in the night, because she did not want to miss a sound that could mean danger. Sometimes she sat beside him and watched his face as he slept, searching for some sign that he was resting rather than slipping away. In those months, the settlement beyond the yard became distant, as if the world had narrowed to the walls they lived inside, and the single fragile life she was trying to keep tethered to it. The children came then, but not with the urgency she had expected. They arrived in turns, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, always with an air of inconvenience they tried to conceal. They stood in the doorway, wiping snow from their boots, asking the same questions she had already answered by phone. How is he? Has the doctor come? Is there anything we can do? They brought groceries once or twice, bags of food that looked generous until she realized they were mostly things that did not need cooking. They stayed for an hour, 2 at most, and then left again with the promises to return soon. She told herself their lives were busy. She told herself travel was difficult. She told herself all the excuses a mother tells herself to keep her heart from breaking before it has to. Her husband did not speak much in those visits. When he did, it was often about practical matters. He asked whether their cars were running, whether their jobs were steady, whether their children were healthy. He talked as if the future were a thing he could still plan for them, as if he were simply taking stock. She watched him from the kitchen, felt the tension in his shoulders when one of their sons mentioned money, or when one of their daughter's eyes drifted toward the shelves where he kept his tools. She noticed what he noticed. The children were older now with worries of their own, and some part of them had already begun to separate the man from the property he represented. It was not spoken openly, but it lay in the air like the smell of smoke after a fire has burned out. When he died, the house held the silence in a way that felt physical. The day itself passed in fragments. A phone call, hands that shook while dialing numbers she could barely see, neighbors arriving with faces drawn and careful. Someone brought soup. Someone brought a blanket. The funeral was simple, the ground hard with frost, the sky low and heavy. She remembered standing by the grave and feeling with a clarity that surprised her that something more than a person was being buried. He had been the hinge that held their family together, the quiet strength that made everyone assume the house would always be there. Without him, the structure of everything shifted. At first, the children behaved as expected. They arrived in a rush after the funeral, stepping into the house with loud voices and forced energy, talking about arrangements, about paperwork, about what needed to be done. They hugged her awkwardly, patted her shoulder, told her she must be strong. She clung to those gestures because she needed them to mean what they were supposed to mean. She needed to believe they were here for her, not just for what he had left behind. Then the language changed. It became the language of sorting, of deciding, of efficiency. One of her sons opened cabinets and announced that half the dishes were old and should be thrown out. A daughter frowned at the faded curtains and said it might be time to make things easier. The word easier appeared everywhere, as if it could soften what they were about to do. They said she did not need so much. They said the house was too large for one person. They said it would be better if things were sold and the money used sensibly. They spoke in calm tones, as if they were discussing weather, and she listened because she was exhausted and because grief had turned her thoughts sluggish. She did not have the strength to argue over a chair or a television. She assumed they would take what was unnecessary and leave what mattered. She assumed they understood the difference. The first things to go were the obvious ones. The old television that still worked, the spare refrigerator in the back room, the heavy wooden table her husband had built. They carried items out with practiced movements, loading them into vehicles, joking lightly with one another as if the work were a kind of normal family chore. She sat in her chair and watched, telling herself that this was temporary, that they would help her settle, that they would return things in some form. When she protested, it was not in anger, but in confusion. She asked where the table was going. She asked why the refrigerator was needed elsewhere. They replied with impatience hidden beneath courtesy, reminding her that she could not maintain such things anymore, that it was for her own good. For her own good became the second phrase that replaced what they could not say outright. Soon, they began to take items that were not merely practical, but personal. Her husband's tool chest vanished one afternoon while she was in the kitchen warming water. She noticed its absence because the corner of the room suddenly looked too empty, like a tooth missing from a familiar smile. When she asked about it, her son shrugged and said he would keep it safe. Safe where? She wanted to ask, but she heard the edge in his voice and swallowed the question. The clock that had hung in their hallway since their wedding disappeared next. She noticed because the wall held a paler square where it had been, as if the house itself remembered what had been removed. Her husband's worn jacket vanished from the hook by the door. A daughter said it was old and should be thrown away. The words hit her with a sharpness she could not explain. Old. As if age were a reason to discard something that had carried warmth. The deeper wound came with the papers. After the funeral, there were forms to sign, accounts to close, benefits to apply for. She was not unfamiliar with such things, but her eyesight had worsened, and grief made her reading slow. The children used that. They spread documents on the table and tapped lines with their fingers, telling her to sign here, initial there, just for the records. They spoke quickly, moving from one page to the next, and she signed because she wanted the burden gone, because she believed they were helping. There were moments when her instincts stirred, when she asked to read something more carefully, but they sighed, looked at one another, reminded her that the funeral costs were high, that bills had to be handled, that she should not worry her head with details. She began to feel like a child in her own kitchen, being guided by people who assumed she could no longer understand her own life. Within weeks, letters began arriving addressed to her that made no sense. Notices of overdue payments, statements with amounts she did not recognize. She placed them in a pile on the dresser, meaning to ask her children when they came back, but they came back less and less. When she called, they told her not to fret, that everything was being handled. Sometimes they did not answer at all. The pile grew, and with it grew a quiet dread. She began to suspect that her signatures had been used for more than paying funeral bills, Yet suspicion felt like betrayal, and she had spent her whole life refusing to believe her children could betray her. It was easier to think she was confused. The final shift happened not as one dramatic departure, but as a thinning. The visits became shorter. The phone calls became brief, then delayed, then rare. One winter, after a storm that knocked out power for 2 days, she tried to reach her eldest daughter. The call went to voicemail. She left a message, then another. Days passed. No response. When her daughter finally returned the call, her tone was distracted, irritated, as if the older woman were a problem that had resurfaced when it was supposed to stay quiet. She said the roads were bad. She said she had work. She said she would come when she could. The woman listened and heard, behind the excuses, something colder than the weather. The truth that her daughter did not intend to come at all unless forced. That was when loneliness became more than an emotional state. It became a condition of survival. The house, still large enough in theory, shrank into a single room because heating the rest was impossible. She dragged a mattress into the space near the kitchen because it was closest to the stove. She tried to make the old wood-burning heater work, but her strength was not what it had been. Splitting wood hurt her shoulders. Carrying it made her knees tremble. She learned to burn scraps instead, bits of old boards, broken furniture that no one wanted. Smoke sometimes seeped into the room, and she would sit with the window cracked open despite the cold, afraid of suffocating in the place she was trying to warm. The irony was sharp enough to taste. Illness visited her the first winter alone. A fever that left her dizzy, coughing that burned her chest. She had no car. The bus schedule was unreliable. She considered asking a neighbor, but pride held her back, and so did fear. She had heard the whispers in town about her situation, the way some people spoke of her as if she were already gone. She did not want to become an object of pity. She lay in bed and waited for the fever to pass, telling herself she had survived worse. When it finally eased, she sat up and realized that there had been a night in the middle of it when she truly believed she might not wake again. The thought did not frighten her as much as it should have. What frightened her was the ease with which the world could let that happen. Neighbors offered help in small, awkward ways. Once, an older man from 2 houses down left a bundle of kindling on her porch without knocking. Another time, a woman she barely knew handed her a bag of groceries at the post office and muttered that she had bought too much. The gestures were kind, but they were also limited, as if everyone understood there was a boundary they would not cross. People in such places survived by minding their own business, by not becoming entangled. She accepted the gifts with a nod and returned to her house feeling both grateful and ashamed. The longer the children stayed away, the more her hope turned into something corrosive. At first, she told herself they would return when the season changed, when work slowed, when the roads improved. She waited for spring as if it were not just a season, but an answer. When spring came and no one arrived, she shifted her hope to summer. When summer passed, she waited for the holidays, believing no child could truly ignore a mother at that time of year. Holidays came and the house remained silent except for the wind. Eventually, she stopped marking time by expectations and began marking it by endurance. Another winter survived. Another summer endured. Another year of watching her own hands become thinner, her hair whiter, her joints stiffer. And yet, she did not throw away the boxes under the bed. She did not burn the papers even when she needed fuel. She did not clear out the last of her husband's things. Those boxes became a kind of anchored memory, a proof that the life she remembered was real. Sometimes at night, when the cold woke her, she imagined her husband standing by the stove, steady and silent, as he had been in life. She imagined the children as they once were, small and loud, racing each other through the hallway. The images were so vivid that for a moment she could forget the empty room around her. Then the wind would strike the wall and the illusion would collapse again. That morning, as she lay beneath her blankets in the contracted space of her life, the weight of all those years pressed on her more heavily than the cold. The settlement outside had continued to shrink, and her world had shrunk with it. She had become, in the eyes of those who remembered her at all, a figure of quiet disgrace, a cautionary tale whispered between neighbors who did not want to look too closely. Yet, beneath that tired surface there remained something stubborn that had not died. It was not optimism. It was not even hope in the bright sense. It was a hard, quiet refusal to vanish without leaving any trace. She stared at the shadowed space beneath the bed where the boxes waited, and her mind returned to those first weeks after her husband's death, to the papers she had signed without reading, to the tools and furniture that had vanished, to the pale squares on the walls where objects had once hung. She could not undo any of it, not by wishing and not by regret. But somewhere inside her, perhaps in a place that had been silent for years, a question formed with an unexpected clarity. If so much had been taken, might something have been left behind that she had not yet found? The thought did not arrive like a miracle. It arrived like a small, sharp point of pain that demanded attention. She shifted under the blankets, feeling the familiar ache in her hips, the stiffness in her knees. The wind rattled the window frame again, and the house responded with a slow groan. The settlement, the children, the years of waiting, all of it seemed to press down on her until she could barely breathe. Then, slowly, she pushed herself upright and let her feet touch the freezing floor. She did not yet know what she would find in those boxes. She only knew that remaining still had led her nowhere but deeper into cold and silence. If there was any chance, however small, that her husband had left something more than memories behind, she would have to reach for it with her own hands. And so, with a movement that felt like the first real decision she had made in years, she leaned forward and pulled one of the boxes from the shadows, drawing the past into the weak light of the room as the present waited, tense and uncertain for what might change. The first box was heavier than she expected, not because of any single object inside it, but because of the years it contained. Dust rose when she dragged it into the pale light that filtered through the dirty window, and she had to pause, coughing softly into her sleeve until the air settled again. Her fingers were stiff, the joints swollen from cold, and the cardboard scraped her skin as if resenting being disturbed after so long. She told herself she would open only one box, only to see what was there, but she already knew that this was not the kind of thing that could be done halfway. Either she would confront what she had hidden from herself, or she would slide the box back into darkness and continue as she had, waiting for the next winter to test her endurance. The lid resisted at first, glued by damp and neglect. When it finally gave way, it did so with a faint tearing sound that made her wince, as though she had damaged something alive. Inside was a confusion of papers, envelopes warped by moisture, notebooks whose spines had cracked, photographs that stuck together when she tried to separate them. She lifted the top layer carefully, setting items on the bed beside her, building a small pile that already threatened to topple. Each piece she touched seemed to carry a different season with it. A receipt for lumber from a year when the roof had last been repaired, a medical bill she barely remembered paying. A postcard from her eldest son when he had first left town, written in a hand that looked too young now, full of promise that no longer existed. She worked slowly, not only because her hands demanded it, but because her mind needed time to adjust. There were moments when she found herself staring at a piece of paper without seeing it, lost in the memory it had summoned. A faded photograph of her husband standing beside the house in summer, his arm raised to shield his eyes from the sun, reminded her the way he used to whistle while working. She could almost hear the sound in the quiet room, thin and bright against the constant wind outside. She placed the photo face down, not because she did not want to see him, but because the weight of his absence was suddenly too heavy. As she dug deeper into the box, the disorder of it became clearer. This was not a collection arranged with any care. It was a dumping ground for things she had not been ready to face. There were official documents mixed with grocery lists, condolence cards resting against old tax forms, scraps of paper on which she had written phone numbers that were no longer valid. The chaos made her uneasy. She had always been a woman who valued order, who kept drawers labeled and shelves sorted, and yet here was the physical proof of how thoroughly grief had unraveled her habits. The box was a mirror of the years after her husband's death, a time when she had stopped believing that the future required preparation. She lifted another layer and uncovered a stack of letters tied together with fraying string. The knot was loose, as if it had been retied many times, and she recognized the bundle immediately. These were letters from her husband, written over the years when work or illness had kept him away from home for weeks at a time. She hesitated before touching them. There was a part of her that wanted to push the box aside and pretend she had never seen them, because opening those letters would mean reopening wounds she had worked hard to dull. Yet there was another part, stronger now, that insisted she needed to see everything. She untied the string and lifted the top letter, unfolding it with care. His handwriting filled the page, steady and familiar, and for a moment she forgot the cold, the settlement, the long years of abandonment. She was back in a different life, one where the absence of a loved one was temporary and bearable. She did not read the letters in full. It was enough to see the opening lines, the way he addressed her, the casual notes about weather and work. She returned them to the box with a tenderness she had not allowed herself in a long time. Beneath them lay more papers, some of them sealed in plastic sleeves to protect them from damp. Those caught her attention. Her husband had never been a man to overprotect anything except what he truly valued. She slid one sleeve free and found inside a set of bank statements from years ago, the account numbers partially obscured by time and ink. Her heart beat a little faster, not because she understood what they meant, but because the very fact of their preservation suggested intention. The next sleeve held a document that looked more official, with a bank logo she vaguely recognized and her husband's name printed clearly at the top. It was a contract of some sort, though the details were dense and written in language that made her eyes ache. She skimmed the lines, catching words like deposit, beneficiary, personal appearance. She did not yet grasp their significance, but a sense of importance settled over her like a thin, electric tension. She set the document aside and continued searching, driven now by something sharper than nostalgia. The second box yielded similar confusion. There were more letters, more receipts, even an old notebook in which her husband had once written down repair plans for the house, complete with rough drawings of beams and measurements. She traced one of the sketches with her finger, remembering how he used to explain such things to her, how he believed that understanding the structure of something made it less likely to fail. It was an odd thought now, given the state of the house around her, but it comforted her all the same. It was in the third box that she found the envelope. At first glance, it did not appear different from the others. It was yellowed with age, its corners softened by handling, but there was a care to it that the rest of the contents lacked. It lay beneath a layer of unremarkable paperwork as if deliberately hidden, and when she pulled it free she noticed that it was still sealed. Her name was written across the front in her husband's unmistakable hand, each letter formed with the slow precision he used when something mattered. She stared at it for a long time without opening it, afraid that if she did, whatever fragile balance she had maintained would shatter. The room was silent except for the faint whistle of wind through the window frame. She became aware of her breathing, shallow and uneven, and forced herself to slow it. The envelope was heavier than it should have been for a letter, as though it contained more than paper. She turned it over, running her thumb along the edge where the glue held it closed. He had sealed it carefully. He had intended for it to be opened. The act of tearing it felt almost like a violation. She slipped a finger under the flap and pulled gently, not wanting to damage what was inside. The paper parted with a soft sound that was louder in the stillness than she expected. Inside was a folded sheet and, tucked behind it, another plastic sleeve. She removed the sheet first and unfolded it. She recognized the date at the top, written months before his death, during the period when his illness had already begun to shadow their lives. The words beneath it were not hurried. They were calm, measured, and deeply unlike the casual notes she had just handled. He wrote of his fear for her future, of his worry that the children would not protect her as they should. He wrote that he had seen changes in them that troubled him, an eagerness to discuss finances, a lack of patience when he spoke of her needs. He did not accuse them outright, but the caution in his language made his meaning clear. He had decided, he said, to make arrangements quietly, not to stir conflict but to ensure that she would have something of her own when he was gone. As she read, her hands began to tremble. He described opening a savings account in her name alone, under conditions that required her personal presence for any withdrawal or transfer. He explained that he had chosen a branch far from their settlement, one he knew their children would never think to search, and that he had kept the paperwork hidden in places he knew she rarely touched. He apologized for the secrecy, writing that he could not bear the thought of her being pressured or manipulated while he was still alive. The final lines were written with a gentleness that made her throat close. He told her that she deserved to live, not simply to endure, and that if she was reading this, it meant he had failed to protect her in person, but hoped he could still do so in some other way. She lowered the letter slowly, as if afraid it might vanish if she moved too quickly. For several seconds she could not make sense of what she had read. The words swam before her eyes, refusing to settle into a coherent meaning. Then, with an almost physical jolt, she understood. Her husband had left her something more than memories. He had left her a path out of the cold. The plastic sleeve behind the letter contained a copy of the account agreement he had described. The bank's name was printed clearly, along with the address of the branch. There were numbers she did not recognize but now understood were vital. There was even a note in the margin, written in his hand, reminding her where he had hidden the original contract should she need it. The meticulousness of it all was overwhelming. He had planned this. He had prepared for her survival in a way she had not allowed herself to imagine. Emotion broke through her restraint then, not as a gentle sadness, but as a flood. Tears slid down her cheeks, hot against the cold skin, and she pressed the letter to her chest as if she could feel his heartbeat through the paper. She thought of the years she had spent waiting for her children to return, of the nights she had lain awake wondering whether she would die unnoticed. All that time, this letter had been beneath her bed, within reach, and she had not known. The realization did not fill her with regret so much as with a fierce, painful gratitude. He had trusted her to find it when she was ready, and somehow on the morning when the cold felt unbearable, she had finally been ready. She did not remain lost in tears for long. The letter had awakened something in her that grief alone never had. It was not simply hope, though hope was part of it. It was a sense of responsibility, as if he had passed her a task that she must now complete. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and began to read the letter again, this time with a practical eye. She noted the bank's location, the date he had opened the account, the specific phrasing he had used about personal appearance. She took a pencil from the bedside table and, on the back of an old envelope, began to write down what she would need. Identification. Proof of marriage. A way to travel to the branch. She did not yet know how she would obtain any of it, but she felt, for the first time in years, that there was something ahead of her that was worth the effort. The cold in the room seemed less oppressive as she worked, though she knew it had not changed. The wind still rattled the windows, and the heater was still cold. Yet the space around her no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a place where something had begun. When she finally folded the letter and slid it carefully into the pocket of her coat, she did so with a deliberate tenderness, as if sealing a pact. The boxes around her were still full of forgotten things, and she would have to return to them searching for the original documents her husband had mentioned, but that could wait. What mattered now was the shift inside her, the moment when she had stopped thinking of herself as a woman who was waiting to be saved and begun, however hesitantly, to imagine saving herself. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding the envelope in her hand, and looked around the room that had become the sum of her world. The walls were still stained, the floor still littered with the traces of neglect, but there was a difference she could not name. It was not in the house. It was in her. For years she had endured. Now, because of a letter written in a quiet moment of foresight, she felt the faint outline of a future pressing against the present, asking to be acknowledged. The letter remained in the pocket of her coat through the restless night that followed. She slept little, not because the cold was worse than usual, but because her mind refused to settle. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw her husband's handwriting, felt again the weight of the envelope in her hand, heard the imagined firmness in his quiet resolve. The house creaked and sighed around her, but instead of the familiar sense of threat, she felt a kind of urgency, as though the walls themselves were urging her to act before doubt returned. By the time the faint gray of dawn seeped through the grime on the window, she had already decided that she would leave the house that day, something she had not done for any reason other than necessity in longer than she could remember. Preparation became a form of ritual. She stood slowly, bracing herself against the bed frame, waiting for the dizziness to pass. Her movements were deliberate, each step planned to conserve energy she could not afford to waste. From the wardrobe, she took everything that might hold warmth: sweaters whose elbows had thinned, scarves that still smelled faintly of soap from a time when she washed such things more often. She layered them on her body, feeling bulky and awkward but safer. The coat that now held the letter went on last, its pockets heavy with more than paper. She tied her boots with fingers that did not bend easily anymore, and sat again to rest, because she knew from bitter experience that pride had no place in survival. The documents were more difficult. She spread the contents of the boxes she had disturbed across the bed, searching for anything that might prove who she was in a world that no longer seemed to remember. There were old identification cards, some expired, some barely legible, a marriage certificate yellowed to the color of weak tea, a death notice from the local paper with her husband's name printed beneath a grainy photograph. She gathered these into a cloth bag she had once used for groceries, folding each paper as carefully as if it were a fragile glass. She knew it was not enough. She knew there would be questions she could not answer, forms she could not fill without help. Still, this was all she had, and it would have to serve. Before leaving, she paused in the doorway of the room that had become her world. The bed was unmade, the boxes open, the air still thick with dust. She felt an irrational fear that if she stepped outside, something would be taken in her absence, that the fragile order she had begun to impose would collapse. The house had been violated so many times that she no longer trusted it to remain intact even for an hour. She locked the door with the small brass key that hung on a string around her neck, aware that a determined intruder would find it no obstacle, but comforted nonetheless by the familiar click. The yard was buried beneath a crust of snow that broke beneath her boots. The path she had once shoveled regularly had long since disappeared, replaced by drifts that forced her to lift her feet higher than she wanted to. Each step sent a shock through her knees, and she had to stop twice before she reached the sagging gate. Beyond it lay the road, little more than a pale ribbon winding through a field of white. The settlement was quiet, as it always was at that hour, but she sensed movement behind curtains, the invisible awareness of neighbors who noticed her presence and did not quite know what to make of it. She did not hurry. There was no need and no strength for it. The bus stop stood a quarter-mile away, near what had once been the center of town. She walked toward it with the patience of someone who had learned that rushing only brought pain. As she passed houses that were little more than shells now, she remembered the people who had lived in them, the children who had played in their yards. Most were gone. Some were dead. A few remained, aging like her, held in place by habit and the stubborn refusal to abandon the soil that had shaped them. When she reached the bus shelter, a wooden structure with broken slats that offered more symbolic than real protection from the wind, she was already exhausted. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes, counting her breaths, reminding herself that this was only the beginning. The schedule posted inside was out of date, the times faded and altered by pencil marks from someone who had tried to keep it relevant. She did not know if the bus would come. She had learned not to assume anything in this place. When it finally appeared, a dark shape emerging from the curve of the road, she felt a surge of relief that startled her. She climbed the steps with the driver's help, her bag clutched to her chest, and took a seat near the front where she could steady herself. The ride to the nearest town took nearly an hour, winding through forests that had been thinned by years of cutting, past abandoned mills and frozen streams. She watched it all with the eyes of someone seeing a world she had almost forgotten. When the bus stopped at last, she stepped down onto a pavement that felt foreign beneath her feet. The buildings here were larger, newer, their windows clear, their doors automatic. She stood for a moment in the swirl of people who did not notice her, who brushed past with phones in their hands and coffee cups steaming, and she felt as though she had crossed into another century. The archive was housed in a low brick building that had once been a school. Inside, the air was warmer, but it carried the dry, papery scent of stored records. She approached the desk hesitantly, unsure how to begin. The woman behind the counter asked her what she needed, and for a moment she could not answer, because the truth seemed too large to compress into a sentence. She managed to say that she was looking for records related to her husband, to their marriage, to any financial matters that might have been recorded. The woman nodded, took her name, and began to type. It was the first time in years that someone had treated her request as legitimate, and the simple act of being heard steadied her more than she expected. The process was not simple. Some files were stored elsewhere. Some had been archived under outdated systems. She was told to fill out forms, to provide identification she did not fully possess, to wait while requests were sent to other offices. She moved from desk to desk, carrying her bag like a talisman, answering questions that felt intrusive but necessary. Each delay was a reminder that the world operated on rules she had been absent from for too long, and that she would have to learn them again if she wished to claim what her husband had left. From the archive, she went to the bank, guided by the address written in her husband's careful hand. The building was a gleaming structure of glass and metal, its interior bright with screens and polished counters. She felt out of place immediately, aware of the contrast between her worn coat and the clean lines of the lobby. When she explained why she had come, the receptionist's smile faded into a neutral expression that held no judgment, but also no promise. She was asked for identification, for account numbers, for documents she could not yet provide. She showed the letter, hoping it would serve as a proof of something, but it was accepted only as a personal item, not as evidence. The rules were clear. Without proper identification and confirmation of her status as beneficiary, nothing could be done. She left the bank with a mixture of disappointment and resolve. She had not expected success on the first attempt, not truly. What surprised her was the absence of humiliation. For once, she did not feel like someone begging for scraps. She felt like someone beginning a task that would require patience and persistence, qualities she had honed over a lifetime of making do. The journey back to the settlement was slower. The afternoon had grown colder and fatigue pressed on her shoulders. She slept on the bus, waking with a start when it stopped, then made the long walk back to her house in fading light. The yard looked different in the dusk, more forbidding, as if it were testing her commitment. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it behind her with a decisive motion that surprised her with its firmness. She set her bag on the table and took out the letter, placing it where she could see it. The room was still cold, still cluttered, still marked by neglect, but it no longer felt like the end of a story. It felt like the beginning of a process. She had been told no, and she had accepted it, not as defeat, but as information. She now knew what stood between her and the future her husband had tried to secure. The path would be long and humiliating at times, but she had taken the first step beyond her threshold, and there was no going back to waiting in the dark. The next morning arrived not with clarity, but with a familiar ache that spread through her limbs before she even opened her eyes. Yet something had shifted. The house was still cold, the air still heavy with the smell of dust and damp, but the weight of the previous day's effort had not crushed her. Instead, it had carved out a narrow channel in her mind, a path she could follow if she resisted the temptation to retreat into the stillness that had once seemed so safe. She rose slowly, wrapping herself in the same layers of clothing, but this time the act felt purposeful rather than desperate. There were tasks to complete, steps to take, and no one else would take them for her. Her first goal was to restore the most basic proof of her existence. The identification cards she had found were not enough, and the bank's polite refusal echoed in her memory like a warning bell. She needed a passport or something close to it, a document that would anchor her in a system that had continued to operate long after she had stopped participating in it. The office responsible for such matters was in the same town as the archive, and she prepared herself for another journey with the same care she had used before, adding a thermos of weak tea to her bag and making sure the letter from her husband was safely tucked into the inner pocket of her coat. The trip was harder this time. The exhaustion from the previous day had not fully receded, and every step from the bus stop to the government building felt as though she were walking against a current. The building itself was a maze of narrow corridors and faded signs, and when she finally reached the correct counter, she was confronted with a list of requirements that seemed designed to discourage anyone without stamina. She was asked for birth records, proof of residence, photographs of a specific size, payment of a fee she had not anticipated. Each demand was delivered in a tone of practiced neutrality, but the effect was cumulative, like a series of small blows to her resolve. She answered questions she had not been asked in decades, giving her full name, the names of her parents, the place where she had been born. Some of the details felt unreal, as if they belonged to someone else's story rather than her own. She was sent to one desk to obtain a form, then to another to submit it, then back again, because she had not initialed the correct box. She did not argue. She had learned in the archive that anger wasted energy she could not spare. Instead, she watched carefully, memorizing the rhythm of the process, the phrases that mattered, the way to stand so that she was not overlooked. The lack of money for the required fee was a more serious obstacle. She explained her situation as simply as she could, not embellishing, not pleading, but stating that she did not have immediate access to funds. The clerk's expression softened almost imperceptibly, and after a pause she was told about a temporary identification document that could be issued under certain circumstances. It would not solve all her problems, but it would allow her to proceed with other requests. The relief she felt was not the explosive joy she had once associated with good news, but a quieter easing of tension, as if a tightly knotted rope had loosened a fraction. Obtaining that temporary document took most of the day. By the time she stepped back into the cold air outside, the sun was already low, staining the snow with pale gold. She returned home with the paper held like a fragile promise in her bag, aware that it was only a first step, but grateful for its existence. She placed it carefully beside the letter on the table, creating a small island of order in the chaos of her living space. The following days settled into a rhythm that was both exhausting and strangely invigorating. Each morning, she set out with a list she had written in a trembling hand, noting which office she would visit and which documents she would request. Some days, she returned with nothing but a new form to fill out. Other days, she came back with copies of old records that confirmed pieces of her life she had almost forgotten. Her marriage certificate bearing the faded seal of a clerk who had long since retired, a record of her husband's employment that linked his name to a company that no longer existed. She learned to carry snacks in her bag, to rest when she could, to accept that she would have to make the same trip many times before it yielded anything like resolution. As her file grew thicker, so did the evidence of what had been done in her name without her understanding. Letters from creditors arrived with alarming regularity, and now, armed with some knowledge of the system, she could see patterns in them that had once seemed random. Accounts had been opened, loans taken, all bearing her signature or a mark that resembled it. The implications were terrifying. It was one thing to be abandoned. It was another to be actively exploited. She began to make copies of every letter, to mark the dates, to keep a ledger of sorts that tracked the unraveling of her financial identity. The act of documentation, tedious as it was, gave her a sense of control she had not felt since before her husband's death. The search for the original contract her husband had mentioned in his letter took place at night, when she returned too tired to travel, but not too tired to continue. She went through the boxes again with a new focus, no longer simply uncovering memories, but hunting for something specific. She checked the backs of drawers, the hollow spaces beneath floorboards he had once repaired, the pockets of jackets that had not been worn in years. Sometimes she was sure she was close, that she had overlooked some obvious hiding place, and the frustration left her trembling with fatigue. Yet she persisted, guided by the certainty that her husband had been precise in his instructions. If he said he had hidden the document in a place she rarely touched, then that was where it would be. One evening, after hours of searching that left her dizzy, she noticed a detail she had overlooked before. In the small desk that had belonged to her husband, there was a drawer that did not slide as smoothly as the others. She had assumed it was simply warped with age, but now she felt the resistance more clearly, a faint catch that suggested something behind the visible back panel. With careful pressure, she pried at the seam, and to her astonishment, the thin wooden panel gave way, revealing a narrow cavity. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of papers that bore the same bank logo she had seen in the plastic sleeve. Her hands shook as she drew them out, unwrapped them, and confirmed that they were the original contract, complete with signatures and stamps that lent them an authority the copies lacked. The discovery left her weak with relief. She sat on the edge of the bed, the papers spread across her lap, and allowed herself a few moments of stillness. The house around her remained cold and dim, but the presence of those documents changed its atmosphere. They were tangible proof that her husband's plan was not a dream or a misunderstanding, but a deliberate act designed to protect her. She placed them in a new folder, one she labeled in her own hand, and added it to the growing stack on the table. Armed with the original contract and her temporary identification, she returned to the bank. This time, the interaction was different from the beginning. The receptionist's neutral smile was replaced by attentive interest when she presented the folder. The staff member who examined the papers did so with care, calling over a supervisor, making copies, noting account numbers. She was still told that further verification was required, that procedures could not be rushed, but she sensed that the balance had shifted. The institution that had once seemed impenetrable now had to acknowledge her claim. Parallel to this progress ran the darker thread of discovering how deeply her children had involved themselves in her affairs. When she visited a legal aid office recommended by one of the clerks at the archive, she laid out her documents and letters on the desk and watched as the young attorney's expression grew grave. She was told, in careful language, that there were indications of fraud, that the signatures on some of the papers were inconsistent, that there were grounds for investigation. Hearing it framed in legal terms stripped away the last remnants of denial she had clung to. This was not merely a family tragedy, it was a crime. The prospect of confronting that reality frightened her more than any winter ever had. She had spent her life defining herself as a mother, and now she was being asked to acknowledge that her children had harmed her in ways that might require formal redress. She wrestled with the idea at night, lying awake in the cold, imagining their faces, their voices, the way they had once laughed in the same room she now navigated alone. Yet, each morning she woke with the same understanding. If she did nothing, she would not only lose the future her husband had tried to secure, but also allow her own erasure to continue unchecked. She began to collect evidence with the same diligence she had once applied to caring for her family. She made copies of suspicious documents, requested transaction histories, asked questions that would have embarrassed her before. The people she dealt with responded to this change in her demeanor, taking her more seriously, explaining processes rather than dismissing her with vague assurances. She was still an old woman in worn clothes, but she was no longer invisible. The strain of it all took its toll. Some evenings she returned home barely able to stand, her joints swollen, her head pounding with information she struggled to retain. There were moments when she thought of abandoning the effort, of letting the cold and silence reclaim their territory. But then she would see the folder on the table, the neat stack of papers that represented weeks of struggle, and something inside her would harden. This was no longer about money alone. It was about asserting that her life had value, that she was not merely a remnant of a story that had ended. By the end of the week, her table was crowded with folders, envelopes, and notebooks. She had begun to keep a ledger in which she recorded every interaction, every name, every date, creating a narrative of her own that the system could not easily dismiss. She knew that the road ahead would be long and that success was far from guaranteed. Yet, she also knew that she had crossed a threshold more significant than the one that separated her house from the road. She had begun to claim, in small, stubborn increments, the right to be alive in a world that had too nearly forgotten her. The winter deepened while she waited, but it no longer owned her in the same way it once had. The cold still pressed into the house, still traced its invisible lines along the walls and through the floorboards, yet now it met resistance. On the table, where once there had been nothing but unpaid bills and dust, lay a growing collection of folders, each carefully labeled in her uneven hand. The act of arranging them had become a ritual that steadied her, a way of reminding herself that disorder could be challenged even in a life that had seemed to unravel beyond repair. The original contract her husband had hidden behind the false panel in his desk was now the heart of that order. She took it out often, not because she needed to reread it, but because its physical presence reassured her that his foresight had been real. The paper bore the weight of official seals and signatures, of dates written with intention rather than accident. Each time she touched it, she imagined his fingers doing the same, imagined him closing the drawer with quiet satisfaction, certain that this small act of secrecy might one day mean the difference between her survival and her disappearance. Her second visit to the bank marked the point at which her struggle began to shift from solitary effort to something shared, however reluctantly, with the system she had once feared. This time, she was not stopped at the threshold by a polite refusal. She was led into a small office with a desk that bore a nameplate and a chair that creaked when she lowered herself into it. The manager examined the documents without hurry, tracing lines with a pen, making notes on a yellow pad. She watched his face, searching for signs of dismissal or disbelief, and found neither. Instead, there was a careful neutrality that suggested he understood the seriousness of what lay before him. She was told that the account existed exactly as her husband had described, that it had remained untouched since his death, protected by conditions that required her personal appearance and verified identification. The words struck her with a force that left her lightheaded. For years, she had feared that whatever he had arranged would be gone, swallowed by the same forces that had taken everything else. To learn that it had endured was to feel a door open in a room she had assumed was sealed. The process, however, was far from complete. The bank was obligated to conduct its own verification to ensure that she was indeed the beneficiary, that no fraudulent claims were attached to the account. They requested further documents, including proof of her husband's death, confirmation of her marriage, and evidence that she had not granted anyone power of attorney that might compromise the arrangement. She agreed to everything, noting the requirements in her ledger, asking for copies of the requests so she could track their progress. The manager seemed faintly surprised by her thoroughness, and she realized with a quiet satisfaction that she had begun to change how people saw her. While the bank worked through its procedures, another process unfolded in parallel, one that touched the darker side of her family's involvement. The legal aid office she had approached took her case seriously once the pattern of irregularities became clear. They requested transaction histories from creditors, copies of documents she had signed, any correspondence that mentioned her name in connection with accounts she did not recognize. Each new piece of information added weight to the suspicion that her children had not merely neglected her, but had actively exploited her vulnerability. The idea that her own flesh and blood could be responsible for such harm had taken time to accept. But now that it had settled into her understanding, it no longer paralyzed her. Instead, it fueled a strange, steady determination. She had spent her life caring for others, excusing their failings, absorbing the consequences of their mistakes. This time, the consequences were hers to bear alone, and she would not do so quietly. The days grew shorter, and her journeys between the settlement and the town became more arduous. There were mornings when her joints swelled so painfully that she considered staying in bed, telling herself she could rest just one day. Yet, each time she felt that pull, she reached for the ledger, opened it to the last completed page, and saw the accumulation of effort represented there. It was not a record of triumphs, but of persistence, and it reminded her that progress in such matters was measured not in leaps, but in inches. One afternoon, as she sat in the legal aid office waiting for a meeting, she overheard a conversation between two staff members discussing a case of elder abuse. The phrase lodged in her mind with uncomfortable clarity. It was not a term she had applied to herself. She had thought of her situation in softer, more forgiving words, as misunderstanding or family conflict. Now, hearing it named, she felt a jolt of recognition. The realization did not come with rage, but with a grim lucidity. What had happened to her was not an accident of circumstance, but a pattern that others had suffered before her. The legal process advanced in cautious steps. Letters were sent to institutions requesting information. Subpoenas were discussed in language that made her dizzy, full of conditional phrases and legal terms she could not fully grasp. Yet, beneath the complexity lay a simple truth. The evidence suggested that signatures attributed to her were inconsistent with her known handwriting, that accounts had been opened in her name without her informed consent. These were not mere errors. They were breaches of trust that could not be undone by apologies. Amid this, she received the first tangible sign that the system was beginning to respond. A small envelope arrived in the mail bearing the bank's return address. Her hands shook as she opened it, afraid that it would contain another request for documentation she could not provide. Instead, it was a notice acknowledging her claim to the account and confirming that the verification process was underway. It did not promise immediate access to funds, but it recognized her as a participant rather than an obstacle. The emotional impact of that recognition was difficult to articulate. She had spent years being spoken over, spoken for, or not spoken to at all. Now, in the impersonal language of a financial institution, her existence was being affirmed. She sat at the table, the letter before her, and allowed herself to imagine a future that was not defined solely by survival. That future, however, was not to be handed to her easily. The weeks that followed were marked by delays, requests for clarification, and moments of acute frustration. There were days when she traveled to town only to be told that the person she needed to see was unavailable, that she would have to return another time. There were phone calls she struggled to understand, messages left on machines she barely knew how to use. Each obstacle threatened to erode the fragile momentum she had built, yet there were also small victories that sustained her. A social worker, alerted to her case by the legal aid office, arranged for temporary assistance that provided her with food deliveries and, most importantly, a supply of firewood. The first time she lit the stove with wood she had not scavenged or begged for, she felt a quiet dignity return to her. The heat that spread through the room was not merely physical, it was the warmth of being seen. Neighbors began to notice the change. Smoke rose from her chimney more consistently. The light in her window no longer flickered out at unpredictable hours. A woman from down the road stopped by one afternoon with a loaf of bread, hesitating on the threshold as if unsure she was welcome. The visitor's presence was awkward, the conversation halting, but the gesture itself spoke volumes. Word had spread that something was happening, that the old woman in the sagging house was no longer waiting for the end. The bank's verification process reached its decisive stage on a day when the sky hung low and heavy over the town. She sat in the same small office as before, her folder open on her lap while the manager explained the final steps. The account, he said, had been confirmed as belonging to her husband, with her designated as the sole beneficiary. The conditions he had set were unusual, but legally sound, and they had prevented any unauthorized access since his death. Hearing this, she closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the magnitude of his foresight. He had anticipated not only neglect but active interference, and he had built a barrier strong enough to hold. She was also informed that the bank had flagged previous attempts to access the account using questionable documentation, attempts that aligned disturbingly with the period when her children had last visited. The manager did not accuse, but the implication was unmistakable. She nodded, feeling a tightness in her chest that was not entirely pain. It was the sensation of a long-suspected truth being spoken aloud in a place that could not ignore it. Leaving the bank that day, she carried with her a document confirming that the funds would soon be available, pending the completion of a few remaining formalities. The paper was light, yet it felt heavier than anything she had held in years, weighted with the promise of stability and the echo of her husband's care. She returned to the settlement with it folded carefully in her bag, aware that the most difficult part of her journey might not be over, but that its direction had irrevocably changed. At home, she placed the confirmation beside the letter, the two pieces of paper forming a quiet dialogue across the table. Outside, the wind howled as it always had, indifferent to human plans. Inside, she moved through the room with a deliberateness that bordered on reverence, tidying a corner, washing a cup, lighting the stove. These were small acts, yet each one asserted her presence in a world that had tried to erase her. The truth was beginning to work, not as a sudden miracle, but as a slow, relentless force that reshaped the boundaries of what she had thought possible. When the bank finally released the funds, the moment did not arrive with ceremony or fanfare. There was no dramatic scene, no swelling of music in the background of her life, only a quiet confirmation printed on thin paper, and the simple fact that her name now stood beside numbers that no longer belonged to someone else. She held the statement in both hands, reading it slowly, not because she struggled with the figures, but because she needed time to accept that the struggle she had carried alone for so long had begun to lift. The first decision she made was not about comfort, but about survival. She went through the stack of letters that had haunted her for years, the notices of unpaid bills and threats of penalties, and she began to make calls. The act was humiliating in a way she had not anticipated, because it required her to admit the full extent of what had been done to her, to explain to strangers why accounts in her name had fallen into chaos. Yet this time she spoke with a steadiness that surprised her. She had documents now. She had a story that could not be dismissed as confusion. One by one, she paid off what she could, negotiating where she had to, closing accounts that had been used to drain her of what little she had once possessed. The relief that followed those transactions was not only financial. It was the knowledge that her house was no longer a target waiting to be claimed by strangers through legal maneuvering. For years, she had lived with the vague terror that someone would appear at her door with a paper she did not understand and tell her that she no longer belonged there. That fear loosened its grip as she watched the debts shrink to nothing. When the last confirmation arrived, she sat at the table and pressed her palm flat against the wood, grounding herself in the reality that this fragile place was still hers. Only after that did she allow herself to think about the house itself. She had grown used to its decay, to the way it absorbed cold and echoed emptiness, but now that she no longer felt as though she were living on borrowed time, she began to see its condition with new eyes. The roof was the first problem she addressed, because it was the most visible symbol of neglect. Water had seeped through its weak spots for years, leaving stains that mapped the slow damage done by seasons she had endured without complaint. She contacted a contractor recommended by a neighbor, a man who had not been to her part of the settlement in a long time, and was startled by the state of her home when he arrived. She did not hide the truth from him. She told him she had been alone, that she had not had the means to repair anything, that she wanted now to do what she could before the next winter arrived. He listened, nodding, his gaze traveling over the sagging beams and warped boards, and then he told her what needed to be done. The price made her stomach tighten, but she did not recoil as she might once have done. She had learned that fear could be confronted with information, and she asked questions until she understood what she was agreeing to. The work began a week later. The noise of hammers and saws was almost unbearable at first, so unfamiliar had the house grown to the sound of purposeful labor. She moved between rooms with care, making tea for the men, watching as damaged sections of roof were removed and replaced with new wood that smelled of sap and fresh cut. For the first time since her husband's death, the house felt like a place where effort was being invested rather than withdrawn. Windows followed the roof. The old frames were pried loose, revealing gaps she had never known existed, and in their place went new glass that reflected the world with startling clarity. When the workers were done, she stood in the main room and looked out at the yard through a window that did not distort or darken the view. The settlement still looked as abandoned as ever, but the barrier between her and it had changed. Cold no longer slipped through the cracks with the same insistence. The air held itself. The stove was repaired next. A technician came to inspect it, shaking his head at the improvisations she had made to keep it running. He replaced parts that had long since failed, sealed leaks she had not been able to reach, and showed her how to regulate the heat more efficiently. The first night she lit it afterward, the warmth spread evenly through the room, not in the erratic bursts she had come to expect, but in a steady, comforting presence. She sat close to it, her hands extended, marveling at the way her fingers did not go numb after only a few minutes. With the major repairs completed, she turned her attention inward, to the smaller changes that together reshaped her daily life. She bought a proper mattress to replace the sagging one she had dragged from room to room, choosing one that supported her aching joints and allowed her to sleep without waking in pain. She replaced broken chairs with sturdy ones that did not threaten to collapse beneath her weight. These purchases were not extravagant, yet each felt like a declaration that she was no longer merely surviving. Cleaning the house was a task she approached with mixed emotions. The piles of discarded things had been an embarrassment for so long that she had learned to look past them, to accept them as inevitable. Now, as she began to gather them into bags, she realized how deeply they had infiltrated her sense of self. Each piece of trash removed felt like shedding a layer of the hopelessness that had clung to her. She worked slowly, not wanting to strain herself, but steadily, clearing one corner at a time, opening spaces that had been closed for years. Neighbors took notice. At first it was subtle, a lingering glance from across the road, a brief nod in passing. Then came the questions. Someone asked whether she had family visiting. Someone else wondered aloud if she had sold the house. She answered as truthfully as she could without opening old wounds, explaining that she was making repairs, that she intended to stay. The idea seemed to surprise people, as if they had assumed that her story would end in disappearance rather than renewal. One afternoon, a woman from 3 houses down arrived with a pie balanced carefully in her arms. She stood on the threshold, uncertain, and for a moment they regarded one another in silence. The visitor's eyes moved over the interior of the house, registering the absence of clutter, the presence of light, the warmth that radiated from the stove. She said little, but her expression carried a message that words were unnecessary to convey. The settlement had not expected this transformation, and it did not quite know how to respond. As the weeks passed, the house continued to change. The smell of damp receded, replaced by the scent of fresh paint in places where she had chosen to cover the stains left by years of neglect. She hung a clean curtain in the window, not because she was worried about being seen, but because she liked the way it caught the light. She returned some of her husband's belongings to visible places, not as relics, but as parts of a living space. The clock on the wall ticking softly once more, the chair he had favored positioned near the stove. The most profound shift, however, was internal. She no longer moved through the rooms with the careful avoidance of someone navigating a ruin. She walked with purpose, carrying groceries that she had chosen herself, setting down dishes she intended to wash rather than stack in resignation. She began to cook again. Simple meals at first, then more ambitious ones as her confidence returned. The act of preparing food for herself felt like a quiet rebellion against the years when she had subsisted on whatever required the least effort. In the evenings, she sat at the table and wrote in the notebook that had once been a ledger of grievances. Now it became something else. She recorded not only tasks and appointments, but also observations, the way the light shifted across the floor at a certain hour, the sound of the stove settling into its rhythm after she fed it new wood. These details anchored her in the present, reminding her that life was no longer something happening elsewhere. The settlement did not change. It remained a place of empty houses and long silences, of people who had learned to keep their hopes modest. Yet, within that static environment, her home became a small point of contrast. At night, when the wind still howled across the fields, her window glowed steadily, a sign not of stubborn endurance but of something warmer and more resilient. The house had ceased to be a grave in which she waited for time to claim her. It had become, once again, a place where life was being practiced, in all its fragile, persistent forms. Winter loosened its grip slowly, as if reluctant to concede that anything had truly changed. The snow still lay heavy in the fields, and the road into the settlement remained a pale scar through a landscape that had learned to endure rather than to welcome. Yet, inside the house at the far edge of town, warmth no longer arrived as a fragile visitor, but stayed, settled into the bones of the place. The stove hummed with a quiet consistency. The new windows held the cold at bay, and the air carried a faint scent of clean fabric and fresh wood rather than dust and neglect. She woke each morning to a room that did not feel like an accusation. Her days acquired a shape that was not dictated by crisis. She rose with the light, sometimes before it, not because the cold forced her from sleep, but because she had begun to anticipate the small ritual she had created for herself. There was tea to brew in a kettle that no longer had to be coaxed into boiling. There were pills to take at regular intervals, laid out in a neat row on the table, prescribed after a long overdue visit to a doctor who had listened without impatience to the list of ailments she had learned to treat as inevitable. There was the simple pleasure of washing her face in water that did not sting, of choosing clean clothes from a wardrobe that now held more than the remnants of past winters. Memory remained, of course. It would have been impossible for it not to. Some mornings she reached for the mug her husband had favored and found her hand lingering there, as if the porcelain carried the warmth of his grip. On the wall above the stove hung the clock he had once fixed with his own careful adjustments, its steady ticking now part of the house's revived heartbeat. She had placed his photograph on a small shelf nearby, not as a shrine, but as a companion to the life she was learning to live again. When she passed it, she did not feel the sharp pain that had once followed any reminder of him. Instead, there was a steadier emotion, a sense of continuity that allowed her to move forward without severing the past. The children remained absent. Their names still appeared occasionally in letters from lawyers or institutions sorting through the consequences of their actions, and she addressed those matters with the same calm diligence she had applied to everything else. The bitterness that might have consumed her in earlier years had softened into something more manageable. She no longer searched for explanations that would make their behavior acceptable. She had come to understand that people could be both loved and harmful, that acknowledging the truth of their betrayal was not a betrayal of her own heart. When she signed papers or answered questions related to their cases, she did so without anger, guided by a simple determination not to allow their choices to define the remainder of her life. Spring arrived in hesitant steps. The snow melted in uneven patches, revealing the tired grass beneath, and the road re-emerged as a tangible connection to the rest of the world. She watched the transformation from her window, cup of tea warming her hands, marveling at the fact that she was no longer measuring the season by the question of whether she would survive it. Instead, she began to plan. The patch of earth behind the house, neglected for years, came back into her thoughts. She remembered how she and her husband had once planted vegetables there, rows of beans and tomatoes that had fed them through summer and into fall. The idea of touching soil again, of watching something grow under her care, stirred a quiet excitement she had not felt in decades. On a mild afternoon, she pulled on her coat and ventured into the yard, not because she had to fetch something or attend to a repair, but simply to stand where the garden had once been. The ground was still hard, but she could see where the borders had been, where the trellis had leaned before collapsing under its own weight. She imagined rebuilding it, not all at once, but piece by piece, as her strength allowed. The vision was modest, perhaps even naive given her age, yet it carried a promise that felt larger than practicality. Her interactions with the settlement changed as well. The neighbors, who had once avoided her out of discomfort or fear, now greeted her with tentative warmth. There were brief conversations at the post office, nods exchanged on the road, an invitation to share coffee that she accepted with some trepidation and left with a sense of cautious connection. She did not seek to become the center of attention, but she no longer hid. The light in her window had drawn notice, and with it came the recognition that she was not merely a relic of the town's past, but a participant in its present. The notebook on her table transformed into something closer to a diary. She wrote not only of appointments and tasks, but of thoughts she had never bothered to articulate before. She wrote about the way the house sounded different now, the creak of a floorboard that had been reinforced, the softer echo in a room that no longer held so much clutter. She wrote about the fear that still surfaced unexpectedly, the momentary panic that she might wake to find everything undone, and the relief that followed when she realized that this time the change was not a dream. There were moments when she allowed herself to think of helping others, not in grand gestures, but in the practical ways she now understood so well. She began to collect information about the services that had aided her, the legal offices, the social workers, the programs that offered support to those who had slipped through the cracks. She spoke to an elderly man she met at the clinic about how to restore identification documents, and watched as his confusion gave way to cautious hope. It was not a mission she announced or pursued with fanfare. It was simply the extension of a lesson she had learned too late in life, but in time to matter. Evenings became her favorite part of the day. As the light faded outside, she lit the lamp on the table, not because she feared the dark, but because she liked the way it softened the room. She cooked simple meals, savoring flavors she had once ignored in her haste to conserve resources. She sat with her notebook, sometimes writing, sometimes simply thinking, and let the quiet surround her without threatening her. The house held her in a way it never had during the years of neglect, as if it, too, had learned to trust that it would not be abandoned again. On one such evening, with the wind rising beyond the walls and the settlement sinking into its familiar hush, she paused by the window and looked out. The road was empty, the fields dark, but the reflection of her own room shone clearly in the glass. She saw the table, the chair, the soft glow of the lamp, and herself standing there, older than she had ever imagined she would be, yet somehow more present in her own life than she had been in decades. She reached into the pocket of her coat, where the letter from her husband still rested, and unfolded it with the same care she had used the first time. The words no longer felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. They felt like a foundation, something solid beneath her feet. She read the final lines again, the ones in which he had written of her deserving to live, and she realized that she had finally accepted that truth. The settlement would likely continue to fade, its houses emptying one by one, its young people leaving for places that promised more than endurance. Her children might never return in any meaningful sense. None of that altered what had taken root within her. She was no longer measuring her days by what she had lost or by how long she could hold on. She was measuring them by what she chose to do with the time that remained. Outside, the night closed in, quiet and implacable as ever. Inside, her window glowed steadily, a small but unmistakable sign that the story of her life had not ended with abandonment and cold. It had turned, improbably and irrevocably, toward something else. Toward life, not as a mere continuation of survival, but as an active presence, a refusal to vanish, a gentle insistence that even in the most forgotten corners of the world, a single person could begin again. If this story touched you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter and the other stories coming very soon. Watch the next video now and discover what happens in our other powerful real-life stories. And if this episode meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to see it today.